In the quiet rise of the Illinois plains, where wind once whispered across endless prairie, stood a building meant to inspire devotion. Instead, it became a place where innocence vanished into darkness. For years, Sacred Heart Seminary was known as the Midwest's most respected Catholic institution, a proud monument of faith and learning, built to raise a generation of American priests. But behind its grand walls, 17 young men vanished between 1847 and 1862, their names erased, their fates sealed in silence. Official records claimed they had been sent to distant missions or embarked on silent retreats, but the truth, hidden for more than a century, was far more chilling. Letters, recently discovered beneath the chapel floor, told a story soaked in betrayal and terror. They spoke of abduction, trafficking, and death. The three men who led Sacred Heart were not priests at all, but impostors, Irish criminals who had killed the original clergy and slipped into their robes like wolves among lambs. The Vatican buried the truth, sealing all documents for 150 years. But that silence ends tonight. This is not just a story about religion. It is a story about power, about trust, about what happens when faith is used as a weapon. And if you are the kind of soul who seeks answers no matter the cost, stay with us. Now step back with me to the year 1847 and witness the birth of a holy institution built upon a foundation of lies. America was changing fast that year. The potato famine drove millions of Irish families to its shores, poor, hungry, and clinging to their Catholic faith. But their arrival stirred rage in Protestant hearts, who saw Catholicism as a foreign threat. Riots broke out, churches burned, and priests were tarred in public squares. The Catholic Church needed American-born priests, men who spoke without accents, understood local customs, and could ease tensions with the Protestant elite. So they built Sacred Heart Seminary, 40 miles southwest of Chicago, a place meant to mold American boys into holy men. It rose from the prairie like a red brick cathedral, with stained glass windows towering 20 feet high, and bells that rang across miles of open land. It cost $40,000 more than most Illinois towns were worth, all funded by wealthy Catholic families from Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. Patrick Murphy, a shipping magnate, Francis O'Brien, a brewery baron, and Margaret Connolly, a widow of fortune, poured their hopes and gold into that school. Inside stood one of the largest libraries west of the Mississippi, lined with rare theology books, science manuals, and classics of old thought. Gaslights flickered through its halls, and heat pumped from a mighty furnace warmed its bones against brutal winters. At its head stood Father Edmund Walsh, a towering man with silver beard and sharp gray eyes. He spoke the refined word. He knew Latin, Greek, French, and German, quoted Augustine by heart, and held degrees in everything from canon law to ancient philosophy. Beside him stood Rector Murphy and Dean O'Brien, just as learned, just as convincing. Murphy wore spectacles and spoke like a scholar, with Belgian degrees to prove it. O'Brien was younger, but his sermons moved grown men to tears. His charm opened doors in every Catholic drawing room across the Midwest. Together, the three became pillars of trust and authority, their presence unquestioned, their power absolute. Even the Bishop of Chicago gave them full control over Sacred Heart, its rules, its teachings, its future. That fall, 12 young men arrived, eager to become priests. Some were sons of German immigrants from Milwaukee. Others were proud Irish boys from Chicago. A few had even converted from Protestant families. They believed they had found holy ground, but in truth, they had walked into a well-laid trap. Each student had been chosen carefully: wealth, strong health, no close ties that might stir suspicion if they disappeared. Their days began at 4:30 with prayer, continued through Mass, and long hours of study followed by physical labor on the vast seminary grounds. They learned Latin, Greek, theology, church law, and scripture, under the strictest discipline. Contact with family was rare. Their letters watched, their movements controlled. They were told it was for spiritual focus. In truth, it was to cut them off from help. Then the snow came. February 1848 brought a storm so fierce it buried the building in drifts that climbed to second-floor windows. It was the perfect night to make someone vanish. Michael Brennan, 22, proud son of a wealthy Irish family in Chicago, had been excelling in his studies. His family paid handsomely to send him to Sacred Heart, believing they were investing in both faith and future. Michael had just written home days before, speaking of joy, gratitude, and hope. On the evening of February 13th, he was summoned to Father Walsh's private office. Students saw him walking down the hallway, portfolio in hand. Voices rose from the office later that night, followed by silence, then nothing. Michael never returned to his dorm. At morning mass, Father Walsh stood tall at the pulpit and told them. Michael had been called away during the night, a cholera outbreak. He said a priest had died. A community near Iowa was begging for help. Michael had gone to serve, despite the danger. It sounded heroic. It sounded holy. But Joseph Kennedy, Michael's closest friend, noticed something odd. Michael's winter coat still hung on the wall, his boots, his gloves, untouched. No man would survive an Illinois February without them. Even more strange, the silver rosary from his grandmother, the one Michael always carried, still lay beside his bed. When Joseph questioned Walsh, the response was swift and brutal. He was accused of pride, spiritual arrogance, punished with isolation, and fasting in the basement chapel.
That basement was no sanctuary. It was cold, wet, and buried beneath the earth like a tomb. There in the dark, Joseph heard things he was never meant to hear. Horses late at night, wagon wheels creaking over frozen ground, voices hushed and familiar, the three priests moving something heavy, grunting under its weight. Lantern light flickered through the dirt-caked window, casting shadows of men at work. He saw it clearly on the third night, a large bundle wrapped in dark cloth, being loaded into a wagon with great care. Not the way you carry wood or food, but the way you carry a body. Then it was gone, the wagon, rolling away into the dark. Weeks later, another student vanished. Thomas Gallagher, 20 years old, son of hard-working immigrants, gentle, kind, full of prayer and promise. Summoned just like Michael, drawn into that same office, that same silence, that same nightfall. The next day, Father Walsh said Thomas had suffered a crisis of faith, left to join a monastery to heal his soul in solitude. But Thomas, too, had left behind his treasured rosary, his savings, untouched, a letter to his sister unfinished on his desk. The sentence stopped mid-thought, speaking of joy and calling in God. Then it ended like a breath cut short. The walls of Sacred Heart hid more than knowledge. They hid a system of silence and death. And this was only the beginning. Heinrich Bear had always been Thomas's closest companion at the seminary. So when he saw the unfinished letter left behind in Thomas's room, he felt a deep unease in his bones. Thomas had read him part of that letter just the night before he vanished. His voice had been full of hope as he spoke of his theological studies and the growing certainty he felt in his calling to the priesthood. He even said he was planning to finish the letter the next day and was eager to share with Maria the powerful lesson Father Walsh had delivered on moral theology. But Thomas never got the chance. Whispers soon filled the seminary halls, though never in the presence of the priests. 12 students had started the year. Now 2 were gone. The official explanations sounded believable on their own, but when held side by side, they began to crumble. Some students defended the priests. They said God's call could strike without warning, and sometimes demanded the shedding of all worldly ties. But others began to notice patterns that chilled them. Michael and Thomas both came from wealthy families. Both were bright, promising students. Both had been summoned to Father Walsh's office shortly before they disappeared. Both had left behind personal items they would never have willingly abandoned, and neither had shown signs of doubt or unrest. The spirit of Sacred Heart Seminary began to shift. The laughter and camaraderie faded. In its place came whispers, caution, silence. Students watched what they said, watched who was listening. A shadow had fallen across their once sacred halls. As the snow melted and spring crept in, more students vanished. By Christmas of 1848, 5 more were gone. Each disappearance was paired with an increasingly elaborate story from the priests. They had grown bold, confident that no one would question them. The third to vanish was Antoine Du Bois from Detroit. His family was rich from the fur trade. He was a skilled woodsman and spoke native languages. One day he was called to minister to a remote French village, supposedly under threat from hostile tribes. He never returned. The fourth was Heinrich Bear. He had been asking too many questions about Thomas. The story was that he had been transferred to a seminary in Baltimore, a special one for German-speaking priests. He was not allowed to say goodbye, not allowed to write until he was settled. By years, and only 7 students remained. The dread was constant. Anyone could be next. They developed a quiet system, watching, noting who was summoned, remembering who owned what, tracking every sign of another vanishing. Joseph Kennedy could not forget the night his roommate Michael had disappeared, nor the week he spent in solitary for daring to ask why. The sound from the basement chapel still echoed in his dreams. He began to observe more closely. Patterns began to emerge. It always happened on cold gray nights, always midweek, always after long private meetings with Father Walsh. Never when visitors were expected. The priest began to change. Father Walsh now wore silk vestments. He checked a gold pocket watch during his lectures. His office gleamed with imported furniture. Rector Murphy filled the library with rare volumes from Europe. He wore gold-rimmed spectacles and a family crest ring no one recognized. Dean O'Brien rode a stallion too fine for any humble priest. He said it was a gift, but the horse was worth hundreds. He took regular trips to Chicago and came back with gifts and a strange glow of satisfaction. When the priests left town, the students were watched by Francis McManus, a silent, nervous man who seemed to live in the shadows. He never spoke of his past, avoided questions, and whenever someone mentioned the missing students, he found a reason to walk away. McManus knew the grounds too well. He moved through storage areas and root cellars that no student had ever seen. He even knew the surrounding woods in a way that contradicted his claim of never leaving. Then there were the letters. Families who wrote to their sons always got replies in Father Walsh's handwriting. Never the boys. The letters sounded warm but were clearly meant to quiet concern. When families asked for details, they were told the students were under vows of silence. When they asked for letters, they were told such contact was only allowed after reaching certain spiritual milestones. Outside the seminary, the town of Millfield began to murmur. Farmers saw wagons traveling the old road at odd hours. Always careful, always slow. Samuel Morrison found items along the fence that bordered his land. A prayer book, a pair of spectacles, a silver crucifix. All belonged to the missing boys. When he brought them to Father Walsh, the priest claimed they had been discarded by students who were renouncing worldly things. But the truth was far darker. The winter of 1849 brought with it a storm of revelations. James Ollie, a student from Detroit, had grown wary. His father was a powerful merchant, his uncle a high-ranking priest. Unlike the others, James had connections, education, and the means to investigate. He began his own quiet inquiry. Notes, patterns, a timeline, and it all started to make sense. He saw the contradictions, the financial secrets. The priests knew which families were wealthy, which lands were valuable, which boys would bring the highest price. The seminary's income did not match its tuition. In December, James found something hidden in the library floor. Letters, coded, written in disguised language. Business words mixed with spiritual terms. James studied them carefully. Slowly the truth unfolded. They were trafficking human beings. The letters spoke of shipments, prime specimens, tasks suitable for labor, overseers, prices, regions, buyers. One letter chilled James to the bone. The German boy brought a premium, sold to coal operations. The Irish lad went to Wisconsin for record keeping. Both gone, both sold. It was a network, sophisticated, dangerous, hundreds of victims, dozens of buyers, routes across state lines. Cover stories crafted to fool even the most attentive parents. James tried to alert his uncle. He wrote in Latin, disguised his words. But the letter came back, marked for theological review. Now he knew they were watching him too. Soon the summons came. Father Walsh's office. O'Brien and Murphy stood like sentinels. The warm facade was gone. Walsh's voice turned harsh. His threats were clear. James could join the operation, use his connections, help find new targets. Or he could stay silent and finish his studies under watchful eyes. James said he needed time, but all knew the clock was ticking. McManus began shadowing him, always nearby, always watching. His belongings were disturbed, notes taken, books shifted. Even his room was searched at night, footprints in dust, the faint smell of smoke. Then James saw something. Every 2 weeks, always Saturday night, the priests held devotions. Silence was required, no student allowed out. But James watched from his window. Lanterns, wagons, movement in the dark. On February 15th, 1850, he slipped out. He went into the basement, past the old chapel, into the tunnels below. What he found changed everything. Chambers dug deep into the earth. Records, ledgers, maps, names, prices, victims. A decade of horror. 200 lives sold. 100,000 in profit. Every detail documented. Then he saw it. A section marked permanent disposal. Names of those murdered. Too dangerous to sell. Too suspicious. Buried across the seminary's vast grounds. 17 souls lost forever. As James read the documents by flickering candlelight, he heard footsteps echo down the stone corridor. Someone was coming, and James had only moments to hide. The footsteps stopped just outside the dark chamber, where James lay hidden. Through the narrow gap between the crates, he could see Father Walsh standing still holding a lantern. His face was twisted with suspicion. Walsh stepped into the room. His eyes scanned the space with the intensity of a hunter. He moved toward the shelves where James had searched the records. Each step was deliberate, each glance probing. James did not move. He barely breathed. The light from the lantern danced across the walls like restless spirits. Walsh inspected every corner. He tested locks. He sorted papers. He whispered curses under his breath. At one point, he stood only 3 feet from James. The smell of stale tobacco clung to his robes. But then Walsh turned, and after one final glance around the chamber, he left. James waited. 1 hour, maybe more. Only then did he emerge. In that darkness, with his heart still pounding, he memorized every detail from the documents he had read. He knew this chance might never come again. Then fate shifted. In March of 1850, salvation arrived from a place James never expected. Bishop Giovanni Montini had come from Rome. His mission was clear. He had been ordered by Pope Pius IX to investigate troubling reports across American seminaries. And Montini was no ordinary bishop. He was a scholar and a hunter of corruption. He had exposed financial theft in France. He had uncovered abuse in German seminaries. Now he had come to the American Midwest with eyes sharp and ears open. His visit had not been announced publicly. Only the highest levels of the church knew he was coming. And even they were given little warning. The secrecy was by design, so no one could hide their crimes. James overheard the news. Walsh and Murphy had spoken in hushed voices. They were rattled. They knew someone from the Vatican was investigating. And James realized this was the opening he needed. He had to reach Montini without alerting the men watching his every move. It was a risk, but James made his plan. He volunteered to help prepare the seminary for inspection. This allowed him to move freely across the grounds. While doing so, he collected more proof. He also found out where Montini was staying. At the residence of Bishop William Corder in Chicago. James wrote a letter, carefully crafted, written in Latin. It appeared to be a simple plea for spiritual guidance, but the words were chosen to signal distress to anyone trained in canon law. The letter referenced questions of morality and authority. It was a silent cry for help. He found a way to send it. He bribed a local farmer named Samuel Morrison, the same man who had grown suspicious of the seminary. Samuel carried the letter 40 miles to Springfield and mailed it there. The reply came fast. Montini understood the danger. Instead of replying through official channels, he arranged a secret meeting. A pastoral visit to a rural church in Millfield served as cover. On March 15th, 1850, in a small wooden sacristy of St. Patrick's Church, James met the bishop. Montini was a small man with piercing eyes and a sharp mind. Speaking in Latin, James presented his findings. Every detail, every name, every hidden ledger, every missing student. He described the forged identities, the hidden graves, the surveillance, the fear. Montini listened. He asked questions. He took notes. Then he acted. Encrypted messages were sent to Rome. Within 48 hours, Vatican records confirmed the truth. No priest named Walsh, Murphy, or O'Brien had ever been sent to the United States. The real men bearing those names had disappeared after boarding a ship in 1846. The ship had been attacked. Pirates. And the priests had never arrived. The investigation exploded. Federal marshals were called. Local law enforcement. Trusted church officials. They surrounded Sacred Heart Seminary. Before dawn, on March 20th, 12 men, armed, ready. Walsh tried protest. Claimed it was religious persecution. Demanded church protection. But Montini confronted him. With evidence. With truth. The mask shattered. Father Walsh was really Seamus McKenna, a violent Dublin criminal, a trafficker, a murderer. His past stretched back decades. Murphy was Liam Doherty, a master forger and financial manipulator. He handled the books. O'Brien was Fergus Lynch, a killer, the one who dragged students away under cover of darkness. Together they had murdered and sold young men. They had operated unchecked for 3 years, until James spoke up. The investigation uncovered 7 bodies buried across the seminary grounds, each grave carefully hidden, each life stolen. The documents showed a network across multiple states: Indiana, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota. Victims sold to coal mines, lumber mills, factories. The profit exceeded $100,000, a fortune for that time. The trial was held in Springfield, Illinois. National attention followed. Newspapers printed every detail. Survivors testified. Farmers described what they had seen. James stood tall, his voice steady, his story unshakable. On August 15th, 1851, the 3 men were hanged. Over 5,000 people watched. Families of victims, church leaders, skeptics. Everyone wanted to see justice done. But the damage was deep. Catholic communities across the Midwest were shaken. Trust was shattered. Institutions once sacred now faced suspicion. Of the 10 students who had been sold into labor, 6 were found and freed. Their scars were deep, some never fully healed, for were never found. They vanished into the machinery of industry and greed. Their families left with silence and grief. James Ollie was offered honors, education, power, but he declined. He chose a different path. He became a federal marshal. His mission was clear: to stop this from happening again. He worked tirelessly for 3 decades, rescued hundreds, shut down dozens of trafficking rings. His legacy became the foundation of modern investigative techniques. The church had to change. They introduced strict verification for priests, unannounced inspections, better communication with Rome. Sacred Heart Seminary was shut down, its grand buildings destroyed, the land sold to farmers. But no one stayed long. Whispers surrounded the place, voices at night, bells that rang from a tower long gone. Some believed it was haunted. Others said it was guilt that lingered. This story is not about ghosts. It is about men, about greed and cruelty wrapped in robes of faith, about how evil hides behind symbols we trust, and how silence allows it to grow. But it is also a story of courage, of one student who refused to look away, who risked everything, who changed everything. Evil does not need darkness. It needs silence and blind obedience. Let this story be a warning. Ask questions. Watch closely. Speak up when something feels wrong. Because monsters are not always in stories. Sometimes they wear collars, and they preach sermons. This was a horror buried within Sacred Heart Seminary, a place built to serve God, turned into a sanctuary for evil.